Très bien, merci de votre invitation et je suis désolé parce que j'ai besoin de parler anglais. For a presentation, I need to speak English. Maybe next year I can come back and I'll speak better French. I'm going to talk about control risks, top 6 risks for the year ahead. We normally do this as a kind of a 20-minute, 30-minute presentation, but I think I'll go through it pretty quick so that we can have more of a conversation and also just see what your ideas on these things are. Control risks, we do this every year. We call it risk map, where we look ahead to the next year to kind of come out from day-to-day tactical security concerns, right, and risk concerns, to try and bring ourselves and our clients into a more strategic way of thinking for the year ahead. We do talk about the next 12 months, but you know, it's just a framework. We're saying that 2022, but this kind of extends to the years beyond that as well. We use this ourselves, so day to day I can be helping my clients with very, very specific things. I could be talking about a very specific operation, let's say here in France or in Yemen. This allows us to kind of come out of that and just have a broader frame of mind, a frame of thinking. And previously, how we've done this, we've done it in a little bit more of a clickbaity way of saying what the top 5 risks are, like number 1, number 2, number 3, as if to say that cyber risk is lower than terrorist risk or something. And it didn't really work. So what we've done is we've decided to talk about 6 categories of risk, kind of equally. And the reason we do that, and I think it's interesting for you guys, because we're all coming from different backgrounds. You know, control risks, we work with our clients. Some clients will be analysts who are only interested in geopolitical risk and political risk. I tend to work mostly with security managers who are really interested in terrorist risk and day-to-day security concerns. And we work with analysts who are only interested in cyber. We'll also work with people on the reputational side, usually compliance officers, who are only interested in due diligence of their vendors and things like that. So this is really a reflection of the type of clients we work with across the risk spectrum. And that's why we've come up with the 6 categories of equal risk. So I'll start with political on the next slide, which is probably the most interesting one. We'll go another one, actually. We talk about political risk. It's probably the most interesting and complicated one that I'll talk about, so I'll spend a couple of minutes on it. Political risk in 2022, we're talking about the idea of a grand geopolitical repositioning. What that means is that 2021 was not really an expected return to normal, well, as some people expected, that it might be a post-pandemic return to things as before. It wasn't really a return to anything. It wasn't the end of the pandemic. It wasn't a return to normal. It was basically just a changing pandemic. What 2021 kind of signaled is that the world is changing. The thing is, we're not going to get too confident and say that we know what that world is going to be. It's a little bit frustrating, but what we're saying is that 2022 is the year of that transition. And 2022, we are advising clients to use 2022 to monitor for what that change will be. What is that change? Fundamentally, it's saying goodbye to comfort zone. And I'm talking primarily here about businesses, private enterprise businesses. There's been a comfort zone that they have operated in for a long time now. And that comfort zone has been a global geopolitical order that is based on consensus and rules in global trade. That is changing. That is a global consensus, a global system that was underpinned historically by the United States. The United States is rapidly starting to retreat from that role. You can see this in some of the more mundane goings-on at the World Trade Organization, for example. The World Trade Organization historically has been where businesses from any country could observe the global rules-based system actually in play. So a company from a small country such as mine, Ireland, could see the rules being enforced at a global level in the World Trade Organization And often the country that was making the appeals to the World Trade Organization appellate board, basically to say country X is not playing by the rules, we're going to complain about it. The United States has historically entered the vast majority of those complaints, those appeals. And interestingly, about half of those appeals historically have never been about direct US interest. They haven't been about American companies. They've usually concerned countries that are not really of a huge concern to US foreign policy or to US companies. It was really showing that the US was interested in having this US enforced global order. What we've seen in the last couple of years is literally the number of appeals that the US puts in there has gone down steadily. What's the main reason for that? Because the US wants to position itself to unilaterally and bilaterally engage in trade war with China, because the World Trade Organization rules doesn't really allow it to do that. So the United States not only has stopped entering appeals to that board, it's actually actively holding up nominations to the board. And that's a real signal that the US is positioning itself to engage in bilateral and unilateral trade policy against its adversaries, number one, China. Now, what does this mean for business? We're going to be really honest about this sitting here where we are. What businesses are afraid of is that the US role is going to be replaced by a China role. We're not saying that's going to be the case. We're saying that 2022 is the year to monitor for a change such as that. And what that means is looking for whether China is going to become the underwriter of global terms and conditions. What we advise clients is that, I'll skip over this part a bit more, but what we tend to advise clients is that 2022 is a year for geopolitical monitoring like never before. We're actually seeing that in our client organizations. We do a survey as part of this exercise, a global risk survey with our clients. 65% of them has said that they are rethinking and reevaluating their strategy when it comes to geopolitical risk. It's really starting to come up at the board level, the C-suite level of companies, to talk about these issues like never before. Moving on to number 2, and I'll go a bit faster through the rest of these. In the world of security, again, usually security managers, when we talk about security risk, we're talking about day-to-day things like terrorist attacks. But also here in Paris, I know security managers who are more worried about petty theft and crime that might affect their office buildings. They're worried about the protests that happen every Saturday and whether they're going to come near their buildings. So those are kind of tactical concerns. But for 2022, to think more strategically, we want to talk about security in the context of state fragility and essentially the rise of dysfunctional, fragile and vulnerable states. What do we mean by that? Really, we're talking about fragile states or state fragility. The pandemic has really been an accelerator of so many things. It's really unveiled a lot of things that we knew were already there. And it's kind of created a nervous breakdown in a lot of well-established, wealthy states. What we mean by state fragility, I mean, I won't, let's not get into the academic definitions of it, but what happens in state fragility? Why is that a security concern? So we're talking about security rather than politics here, right? When a state becomes fragile, its institutions struggle to uphold law. They struggle to enforce a friendly environment for business and organizations to operate. When security issues do emerge, those institutions struggle to keep a hold of them, or they struggle to keep the balance between basically the balance in the social contract. That means you can have protests every week, but we'll also have security within the state. There's that balance, and in state fragility, that becomes unbalanced. And that means that in a country where the state is becoming fragile and weakened, it becomes a day-to-day tactical security issue for security managers. What are the things we're looking for in identifying fragile states? We're thinking about where, in 2022, where there's going to be prolonged pandemic, where the state really struggles to get a hold of the pandemic, struggles to balance that with all the other concerns of the state. Persistent inflation, less talked about, but probably one of the biggest drivers of state fragility. Persistent and uncontrolled inflation, and also tightening liquidity. And again, we're talking in the realm of business here primarily. So in a state where liquidity is not available or is less available, there's less innovation, there's less exploration in the business world, and it results in kind of backward, downward facing curves. Drivers of this kind of state fragility, well established, things like extreme poverty. We're seeing, because of the pandemic over the last 2 years, we've seen the previously downward curve in extreme poverty in the world is starting to crumble a little bit. We're also looking at drivers like youth unemployment as a driver of things that can break the social contract and lead to state fragility, and food insecurity. And at the worst case, when we talk about state fragility, we're going to the level of conflict and outright war, right? Now, when we talk about fragile states, you think about places like Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Somalia. These are the obvious fragile states, which are all high-risk security zones right now. But for every Yemen and Syria and Lebanon, there's also a Russia, a Brazil, a Turkey, a United States, a United Kingdom. And indeed, over the last year, the United States in particular, not far from this time last year, we saw just how fragile the state authority is in the United States and how fragile it's becoming. Say again?
With the capital crisis?
Exactly. So even in the world's most established, seemingly established and dominant countries, we're looking at those places when we're talking about state fragility. We're not talking about the war zones necessarily. We're talking about right here at home. Moving on to risk number 3, where we'll talk about terrorism. For 2022, we're basically moving the narrative that has been dominant for the last 10 years or so. The global terrorist narrative has really been about right-wing extremism being the primary terrorist threat. And for 2022, we're bringing that back to the kind of more traditional post-9/11 terrorist analysis. And the reason for that is probably obvious. Number one, it's the Taliban's victory in Afghanistan. And that combined with COVID, kind of creating the environment that is going to allow international terrorist organizations to potentially grow. And so you have two factors there. Number one, there's the Taliban in control of Afghanistan. They say that they're not going to allow it to become another breeding ground for international terrorist groups. They want to seek international legitimacy. Whether they will or not remains to be seen. Whether they can or not remains to be seen. The Taliban is not necessarily one organization with one leader at the top who makes all decisions. It's a fractured and fragile organization itself. So Afghanistan could become that breeding ground again. There's no longer US drones running around the skies keeping things in check. Combine that with how that Taliban victory is seen by other organizations currently engaged in conflict. You think of the Houthi movement in Yemen, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Sana in Mozambique, various groups fighting in Francophone West Africa, groups that are seeing that victory in Afghanistan and seeing that there's a potential to have that strategy of waiting 10, 20 years to beat some of the most powerful military organizations the world has ever known. And so you've this factor combining then with COVID and the pandemic, which is driving young men in particular towards radicalization. Young men being barricaded inside their bedrooms for a long time, combined with what social media is doing in terms of driving people to the extremes, combined with potentially re-emergence of international terrorist groups in Afghanistan, there really is a breeding ground there for the return of that kind of post-9/11 international terrorist threat. Number 4, cyber. Cyber is nothing new. We talk about it every year. What we're saying for 2022, however, is that what we're telling our clients is that you're on your own when it comes to cyber risk. Do not expect the state to help you. What we do know is that states are falling behind in their cyber capabilities. They're not willing or able to defend the critical companies and organizations within their own states, including their own ministries. At the same time, we know that the same states are kind of in bed with cyber criminal organizations to fill that gap, to target their adversaries. And in the middle of all this is companies who are just being targeted. Not just companies, but state institutions, NGOs, everything. But we're telling companies that you're kind of on your own. You need to deal with this yourself, which seems a little bit obvious. But the reason we are being blunt about that is because in our surveys, we found that 80% of our respondents in companies still don't know who's responsible for cyber risk. It's not really been dealt with very effectively in the industry, to be perfectly honest, despite the fact that cyber risk is an existential threat to a company, to an organization. We talked about political risk and terrorism, for example, and security risk. If there's mass protests and civil unrest here in France, your building in Paris may get targeted or may be a victim of collateral damage. With cyber risk, you could be spread all over the world, and within a week, your entire organization could be compromised by a single ransomware attack. All the financial capital you have could be wiped off by a cyber event. And increasingly, we're seeing cyber criminal organizations, often in bed with states, targeting companies in that nature, basically threatening them existentially, and also going after critical national infrastructure, which has been an emerging trend over the last 2 years. Moving on to number 5, and close to wrapping up here, when we talk about operational risk, things that challenge a business's ability to just operate day to day, to get people to the office, to get the mail through the door, to get people online. It's no surprise really that the biggest operational risk for next year, and indeed for the entire generation ahead, our whole generation, is climate change. I don't think it takes much explanation, but similar to cyber, we want to start getting our clients to start thinking about climate change as an existential threat because of extreme weather events and what they can do in terms of operational risk. We've started seeing this in the last couple of years with our clients coming to us, asking more questions about tracking forest fires, for example, like mass forest fires, or tracking earthquakes across the world, which is not our specialty at all. But they basically want people to be monitoring these situations. And the reason for that is again, because it's an existential issue. If you get freak weather events across Central and Western Europe, or let's say East Africa, all of your offices in that location, all your people are under threat. And the issue that creates for risk managers is you get crises within a crisis. So you could have, let's say, famine or drought in the Horn of Africa, which you do. That's an extreme case. Here in Europe, we had extreme flooding events last year. What that does is that an office in one city can be threatened, and an office in another city, in another country, can be threatened by the same disaster. And it means that in the framework of crisis management, that becomes really difficult for companies to manage. It's something that's pretty new, and we're helping clients to kind of upgrade their organizational structures to deal with that. Last and not least, number 6, in the world of reputational risk, we're talking about stumbling into the ESG stampede Just for the people who are in the room here, could I get a show of hands? Does anyone know what ESG stands for? Great. Because I have colleagues in control risks who use this term a lot and never ask anyone if they know what it means, which is important. It's actually exactly why it's up there. ESG basically stands for environmental, social, and governance. And we talk about ESG risk. It's something that has kind of come to the fore in the last 2 or 3 years. What it means is that companies are more expected to have credentials that show that they're not impacting the environment too much, and also that their social impact is not negative, so that whatever the product is they're producing is not using, like in the worst cases, is not using slave labor in their supply chain, or is not using underpaid labor in their supply chain, or is not using materials that are damaging to the environment. And in terms of governance, that they're using a governance structure that means that they're not facilitating bribery and corruption in their markets and in the areas where their supply chain comes from. What's driving this is a number of things. First of all, there is state regulation. There is regulation from certain countries that is driving this. So companies are basically being more scrutinized by the countries that they operate in to follow ESG standards. They're also being driven towards this by their shareholders, who are increasingly just more conscious of these issues. And in some cases, you may have heard that term activist shareholder, which is specifically targeting companies with bad ESG records, shareholders investing money and then forcing the company to follow an ESG standard. And also consumers. We as consumers are increasingly more aware of what we consume and the supply chains around the products that we consume, and we're asking the companies that we buy stuff from to improve their impact across these 3 spaces: environmental, social, and governance. This is happening to such an extent that companies are now, let's say if they're merging or they're being acquired by another fund, they're expected to provide matrices, like a matrix that shows where they score high and score low. So they might score high on environmental. Let's say it's a bakery. Let's say it's an international bakery firm. Its environmental impact is probably minimal, so it scores quite high there. But if it's using labor from a place where the workers are not treated well, it scores low on the social side, right? Simple example. But so we're seeing companies wanting to comply in this world, and it's going to become an area of what we call hyper investment over the next couple of years. Companies are already enlarging their compliance departments to deal with this ESG thing. At Control Risks, we are actively hiring people to advise our clients specifically on ESG issues. And it's going to become much more of a present issue. And the risk that we're stating for next year is not to stumble into it, because what we see is that companies really wanting to score high on the environmental front. For example, you'll have oil and gas companies or companies that work on they work with carbon emissions, and they offset that by investing in forestry, right? So rather than reduce their emissions, they just buy something that offsets it, right? Something I'm not personally a fan of, but it happens. And that allows them to score high on their environmental scores on ESG matrices. So they might invest in a reforestry program in Central Africa, right? Which is a popular thing to do. And then you go and you look at that forestry program, you see that the people working in it are basically slave labor. So you tick the environmental box and your social box goes down. And that's what we're warning of. Don't prioritize E ahead of S, don't prioritize G ahead of S. Treat it all as one, and be genuine about it, rather than just seeing it as a box ticking exercise. I've talked for a long time. They're very complicated issues. We're talking about global risk at a strategic level. keen to just start the conversation and maybe stop talking, let you guys have the table for a bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.